people representing different sectors around some of these nature-based and hybrid solutions, really how they're working in different ways in terms of moving the use of these solutions forward. So I'm excited to have these three panelists here who have all been working in this space. They're involved in pretty different ways. You probably recognize Jenna from earlier. So just to remind you that her role is Senior Director and Coastal Engineer from Cummins Cederberg. Rachel Rhode is Manager for Climate Resilient Coasts and Watersheds at the Environmental Defense Fund. EDF has been a really valued partner for us, especially on resilience, local resilience issues like engaging around the Army Corps Collier County study. And she'll be telling you more about her work during this panel. And last, we have Tom Ankersen, who is Professor Emeritus from the University of Florida Levin College of Law. And he's also the Director Emeritus for Florida Sea Grants Legal Program. And I do want to mention that I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with Tom for a little bit. When I was doing my PhD at UF, he was a co-instructor for a course on sea level rise in Cedar Key. And he continues to do some work there. So I think that's been a very pertinent connection for me in doing this work. So I'm just going to highlight that you would have seen Jenna give a talk earlier, so she can certainly expound and reference some of that material. Tom will be giving a talk at the end of the day, and so might give you sort of a overall framework to work from here and then get into some more details later in the day. And I also just want to acknowledge also that among our audience, we really also have people who are engaging, some people engaging in the space in some really unique ways too. And so we'll take some opportunity after our panelists talk to try and see if there's some perspectives that people can add to what our panelists talk about. So I'm going to start with a question, sort of a two-parter question that I'm going to pose to our speakers to let them introduce themselves. So what I'm going to ask them, first I'm going to note that we may have laid out some starting ideas in our opening comments, but I'm going to ask them as they introduce themselves a little further to talk about what comes to their mind when they hear that concept of nature-based and hybrid solutions. What does that mean to you? And also, what's led to your career, what has led to you or your organization working in this space? So first, I'm going to have Rachel introduce herself. Again, talk a little bit about that, what those concepts mean to her and how she started kind of working in this space.
Hear me? Okay. Yeah, thanks, Carrie. Thanks, everyone, for giving me the space to be able to talk this morning. So yes, my name is Rachel Rhode. I am a manager with our Climate Resilient Coasts and Watersheds team at EDF. We are a global nonprofit. We have about 1,000 employees. I'm actually based in St. Petersburg, Florida. We have a very small contingent here in Florida. I have the privilege of being the only coasts and watersheds person in the entire state of Florida for EDF. So I deal with the entire state myself, and the other half of my time is actually spent working in coastal Louisiana. So I do a lot of cross-state initiatives, taking lessons learned from other places and trying to bring them here to Florida. A little bit about my background as well. I by no means thought I was going to work in nature-based solutions. I'm actually a marine biologist by training, but my thesis work in grad school, which I did all my school down here in Florida, couldn't do that in the Midwest, so had to come down here. I actually did my work on river diversions in Louisiana along the Mississippi River and their impact on oysters in the Delta, which at the time I did not know I was working on nature-based solutions. But that actually led me to EDF, working on the team that used to be called Restore the Mississippi River Delta. All the folks that I did wrote my thesis on, I actually ended up getting to work with on that team. And so to this day, I still work on that coalition in coastal Louisiana, and now am a huge advocate of nature-based and hybrid solutions. So that's kind of a little bit of how I got into the space. And when I think of nature-based solutions, I think of this dual purpose solution, right? It's providing typically an ecosystem benefit, but also a socioeconomic benefit, providing benefits to human well-being, and also having co-benefits to the environment, such as increased biodiversity, carbon sequestration, et cetera. One of the things I love, one of my colleagues that I work with up in the New York, New Jersey region, she loves to call nature-based solutions a 21st century solution to a 21st century problem. I don't think nature-based solutions are new. They may seem new, but if you actually really think about what they're trying to do, whether it's emulate, mimic, or restore a natural process, a lot of these are actually indigenous solutions. And so traditional ecological knowledge has actually informed a lot of the nature-based solutions that we work on today. So calling it a 21st century solution might be a little too new, but yeah, that's it's something that in my mind does the duality of both mitigating as well as adapting to future and current climate impacts.
So I think that's a really great point to drill down in a little bit. And just for, if people aren't familiar with sometimes how the word mitigation and adaptation might be used, typically with mitigation, we're talking about that sort of carbon sequestration, that ability to address causes, emissions. And the adaptation part is where we're really looking at, how do you use those options, sometimes with a lot of other layered solutions to help us address impacts that, Rob set the stage for, the flooding and heat and whatnot. So thank you so much. Jenna, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. Thank you, Carrie. So I'll start with the second question, which was kind of what led me to my career and a little bit of background about me. I had mentioned to you before, 20 years as a coastal engineer, got my undergraduate degree in ocean engineering from Florida Institute of Technology over in the East Coast, and further went on to get a coastal engineering degree from that same university, and spent the early part of my career really doing a lot of research dives on artificial mitigation reefs, which, if you're familiar with beach renourishment projects, oftentimes you have mitigation reefs installed when you come in with a new beach fill, and you're impacting that near shore natural reef zone. And so my charge through my thesis work was taking a look at the engineering stability of those artificial reefs. And so at the time, similarly, didn't really realize I was working on, quote, nature-based type projects, and then coined the phrase as my career has kind of gone on from there. So a little bit about Cummins Cederberg. Let's see, headquartered in Miami. We have 6 offices throughout the state. We're about 70 people statewide. And our focus, we're fairly niche. We're specifically focused on that coastal and marine engineering environment and environmental consulting firm. So working primarily with local governments, but also in the private sector as well, both throughout the state and internationally, working with all levels of the federal government as well as local governments. So the bread and butter of our work is working in and around where the tide touches every single day. It's not something that we just do a one-off. This is solely what our focus is. And so these conversations with regulators and in local governments and agencies is something that we do day in and day out. And so it does spur a lot of discussion when we look at it and things in the context of resiliency now. And that kind of buzzword that we hear and talk about a lot. So things that come to mind for me when we think about nature-based and hybrid solutions, nature-based solutions in the context of coastal protection and flood protection are our primary, what we primarily look at on the engineering side. And those are things that naturally or very closely follow the natural features that provide protection against erosion and coastal flooding, such as beaches and dunes, wetlands, oyster restoration, doing quite a bit of that along the Back Bay areas, which are oftentimes, we feel like in Florida, we've got the beaches side relatively down, right? It's not a perfect system, but we've had the solutions in place for quite some time through the beach restoration program and all of the guidance and regulations associated with that. But it's the Back Bay areas that are quite vulnerable and where I've been spending a lot more of our time focusing on those. When it comes to hybrid solutions, those to me are things that combine both the natural features with more engineered or gray, robust type solutions where you have a greater degree of vulnerability or greater wave climates and storm surge considerations. And so my first kind of introduction to that term nature-based features was following Hurricane Sandy. I was doing some work for another firm at the time. And we had, at that firm, we did quite a lot of work with the Army Corps of Engineers. And following Hurricane Sandy, there was a lot of discussion in the New England area about what to do following that storm. And that was really kind of a pivotal thing that kind of led to a series of the Army Corps of Engineers coastal comprehensive study efforts that they did in the New England district, and now have, South Atlantic Division has also similarly done one for the Southeast region of the country. And so we're seeing this engineering with nature concept and this umbrella of solutions kind of unfold. And it's really cool to see over the course of the last 10 plus years, these types of conversations happening at all levels. So,
And Tom?
Is this working? It is. Okay. Yeah. So I'm Tom Ankersen. I was going to say recently retired, but suddenly it's not so recent, but a retired law professor from the University of Florida College of Law. And in that capacity, I ran what's called an environmental law clinic, where I would have students who would work under my supervision on largely policy projects and regulatory projects. We didn't do litigation per se. I would look for opportunities for students to become engaged with communities, both local governments and to some extent not-for-profit organizations as well, where they could get experience and we could assist that community as well. And so I did that for some 25 years. And as a result, there's a lot of former students like Carrie around the state who I can say were my student, and I always say they still are my student. And in that sense, I've always been interested in sort of pushing the envelope in terms of public policy and where it can go in the environmental sector. I grew up in Florida. I grew up on the beach in Melbourne Beach. And so it was kind of natural for me when I went to law school to move into the environmental law arena. Practiced for 4 or 5 years in the private sector, and even before law school for 4 years, I practiced in a consulting firm similar to Jenna's, but a bit more broad-based, doing engineering, planning, and so forth. So I got some good skills in that regard. The other aspect of my work, I think, as a lawyer, which is, I won't say it's unique, but at least it's been beneficial to all concerned, is the interdisciplinary nature of it. So Carrie's a good example of that. She was a PhD student in a class that I had with a fisheries professor on Cedar Key, a short class. But all of my classes over the course of my career have had PhD and master's level students taking the class with the law students, and we would put them together and we would try and drive that science into policy, typically at the local level through comprehensive plans and land development regulations, but also to some extent through state regulation and legislation as well. I'll talk more about this afternoon. A lot of you have talked about permitting and what can be done to enhance the speed at which permitting happens for these nature-based solutions without throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as they say. And so we'll talk a little bit about that dynamic as well this afternoon. Nature-based solutions is a new term for an old idea as far as I'm concerned. And every generation has to have that new term in order to focus people's energy around it. So what my colleagues here have said is I would just echo. It's an opportunity to do with nature what do engineering with nature. I mean, that's probably the right term for it. And in terms of the hybrids, that's a slippery slope too, because how much hybrid is hybrid before it's just another seawall and you plant some mangroves in front of it, and is that still a hybrid solution? So I think we could have that discussion a little bit too, and that's important from a policy perspective in terms of how you move forward permitting these things and so forth. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to highlight again that we've got a really sort of diverse representation of people working on these solutions from very different perspectives and sides. So, nonprofit, university level, obviously previous consultant experience too, consultant, providing advocacy, technical support and capacity, policy, engineering, advice on implementation. Clearly we have other folks in the room and online who can represent other pieces to this as well. Maybe it's scientific expertise, on the ground community members with important local knowledge and needs, local government, other kinds of practitioners. So I just want to acknowledge that there's lots of people needed to kind of move these options forward. But I'm going to now give our panelists a little bit more time to speak both a little bit more about sort of their specific work, what they have done and what they do, but also how the sector that they work in contributes to moving the use of nature-based solutions as essential pieces of our adaptation strategies forward. So Rachel, we'll start with you again.
Sure, yeah. So like you said, Carrie, we're at the heart, nonprofits, groups like EDF, we are very much on the advocacy side. So that's everything from dealing with federal and state policy reform to working on community engagement at the most granular level. And so I guess I have the freedom of not being non-governmental, of having usually fewer restrictions, fewer guidelines that I have to work within. And so advocacy allows us to do that. I think what a group like EDF brings uniquely is that we work not just in one state, but we work globally. And so we're able to bring lessons learned from other places. Florida is certainly one of those that is learning from other places. I know you mentioned Dr. Brooks, our Chief Resilience Officer for the state. It's taking a lot of lessons learned from other Chief Resilience Officers, notably Louisiana, Texas, New York, New Jersey. Some of those states are about the same pace as we are. Some are a little bit more ahead. But I think, you know, we're able to kind of, as an advocacy group, also act as this connector, this kind of in-between liaison, if you want to call it that, connecting what's happening at the federal level around nature-based solutions and hybrid solutions with agencies like the Corps, FEMA, and translating that down to the most granular level with local communities and helping them understand some of these complex regulations and requirements around NBS and what that means. And then vice versa, we also elevate what's happening on the ground to the federal agencies and try to inform things like the Water Resources Development Act and appropriations, trying to support communities for the outcomes that they want to see. What was the first question? Did I answer everything that you've asked? Okay. Okay.
And I was just going to note that that's always an interesting idea of connecting people to the right resources, the right expertise. I heard it once kind of termed being like a data broker or a resource broker, and that's certainly really important. Jenna, do you need me to repeat the question or do you remember? Yeah, a little bit more about what you do and sort of how your sector helps sort of move these nature-based solutions forward is this important part of our toolbox.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, my technical background is in engineering, and that's kind of the easy part, right, when it comes to these types of forums and when you're tackling a project. So I think the one thing that we do really well that helps to kind of move the needle is just really rolling our sleeves up and taking all of this background knowledge and past project experience and applying it forward to the next one and all of the lessons learned that we have. And so if you talk to any one of our team members, we are happy to sit down and, almost give free advice, really, because it's for the greater good, if you will, of we want to see these projects succeed. And anything we can do in terms of knowledge sharing, we're happy to do so. So we have a lot of our team members, myself included, involved in various professional organizations where we're having those conversations at different venues and, at different levels of those organizations, locally and otherwise. I think the other, important thing is to keep those multidisciplinary conversations. So that's one thing that we do really well when we start a new project and we sit down with the clients, is that we don't just have the project manager meeting. It's not just a singular person. You have someone who's a permit specialist that's in the room. You have a planner in the room. You have a coastal engineer in the room who does the modeling. We would have a marine structures person there. We would have an ecologist in the room to cover anything that's needed when it comes to what conditions oysters like to thrive in, or what types of vegetation is appropriate for certain slopes and conditions. So we're kind of pulling that multidisciplinary team together at the front end of the project to go over some of those constraints at the forefront so there are no surprises at the end. And then what that does is it breeds new ideas, right? 3 heads are better than 2 and so on. Does that answer the question? Did I cover?
Yeah, I
everything?
think so.
Okay.
I want to highlight that, I think Jenna represents sort of, and her firm and some of the work that they're doing, we've got on the ground implementation. And you have already pointed out some of the challenges that you guys have taken on in the sort of permitting sphere of things. And I think this is an interesting time to sort of move the conversation over to Tom, who can give us a little bit more of that larger policy framework.
Thank you. So at some point in these questions, there's something about sort of going through projects from the past, right? And so I don't want to get ahead of myself here. And at some point, meaning in this panel.
You can talk about.
Oh, well, whatever. In terms of the need, so what we've heard already and we'll hear more of is that the current statutory and regulatory framework for what we're trying to accomplish here doesn't quite work. And it doesn't work as well as it could and should. And that's because that's a legacy statutory and regulatory framework. It was built upon a world that doesn't exist anymore, right? It was a world where at one point in time, we thought there was something called a balance of nature. And now scientists will tell you that's out the window. That whole concept of the balance of nature is gone, that nature is constantly changing and it's moving in different directions. We are certainly out of balance with it now based on our climate crisis as well. And that doesn't seem to be anything that's going to subside anytime soon. So we have to think differently about how we address protecting our environment. So I think that's sort of driving sort of the philosophical, if you will, philosophically driving the conversation today and around the state and around the country. And the law is slow and it hasn't caught up with that. And so again, that's something I've always sort of been intrigued by while wanting to protect the natural environment. What does it mean to do that? And how can you accomplish that in a changing environment, particularly one where climate is driving that change? So that's the sort of aspect of that. And a lot of the stuff that people want to do can't be done without changing the law or reinterpreting it, which is another thing that we do, interpreting it differently. And that requires that we educate the regulatory agencies with whom we work. It also requires that we pay them more, I think, because otherwise they'll move right into Jenna's firm as they should if they're good. But then Jenna's firm will have a hard time getting a permit because it's going to take 2 years and that staff person's going to have been gone. And so that's kind of another dynamic. That's, I guess, a social dynamic that has to be addressed as well.
Yeah, on that point, I mean, I will, say long before my time even, I mean, we do have former regulators on our team, and I think that they do, although there's a drawback from that perspective, I think they have a really unique perspective too, that they know the inner workings of the regulations and the staff. And that has really been something that's been helpful for these projects and for particularly local governments, right, to kind of navigate, because it can be time consuming, it can be challenging, there can be surprises. And a lot of times those folks on our team are helping to train younger staff, right, that have backfilled roles from folks who've moved into other departments or moved on entirely out of that particular profession. And so that's been helpful to kind of continue to move the needle, is to have folks on both sides of the table, if you will. One thing I wanted to mention too that was touched on is, the importance of data collection and monitoring of these projects. That's something we have done quite a bit of effort on, particularly where we've got great large-scale projects that have been funded through a grant and they've gone into the ground, and then, well, we just hope for the best, right? And so we have a lot of folks on our team who do quite a bit of research, and we partner with University of Florida. We've also partnered with University of Miami and other institutes to do some post-construction monitoring to evaluate the performance and then bring that back into the fold when we talk about lessons learned and scoping of new projects and things to kind of be out on the lookout for and to consider. We're doing a project now with the Manatee County throughout the Manatee River doing large-scale oyster restoration projects where we've leaned a lot on the work from Tampa Bay Estuary Program and others, as well as some published documentation and the county's own experiences within the river and those site-specific conditions. And so I think, you know, we've gone and deployed ADCPs and all of those things that went above and beyond what the scope entailed, because that's just the right thing to do. And I think that that's what's needed to think outside the box and go that extra mile to continue to push these projects forward.
So that kind of triggers a little bit in me from the standpoint of just on the side of advocating and educating around nature-based solutions, these hybrid options, is the data piece is so important and really understanding how these things are functioning in particular environments. And I can't overstate how important it is to be building in that sort of monitoring piece of some of that, especially when, as you probably have seen throughout these conversations, that a lot of these options do need to be very site-specific in nature. You know, what works in one place might not be as transferable to another place. So, you know, I think in the adaptation sphere where we know that the needs for different communities are so different, you know, not everything is transferable, and we really need to figure out what's going to work for a particular area. So it is really understanding how these options are working there. So I'm just going to check our time. So we're doing pretty well for time here. So I'm actually going to pose a question or two, and then I'm going to open things up to the audience. So I am curious for you all, what is one thing you wish others knew about your sector and working in this area? I mean, are there certain challenges that you've experienced and you just wish people understood the sort of role you have, or just want to throw that out there, and whomever would like to answer can go ahead.
Sure, I'll go ahead. In terms of sector, and we're talking the law and policy sector, it's incredibly complicated. This area between the water and the land, the property line moves with the erosion and with the accretion. And if there's a storm, it may not move. And there's just all of these variables going on that you don't typically see elsewhere. So you have an eroding shoreline that continues to be public. If it's an accreting shoreline, it continues to be private. You have to measure it. That's the mean high tide line. That's an astronomical determination. All of that is very complicated. And then you have this these huge resource questions and public resource questions butting up against private property questions. And I think that dynamic is what's fascinating, of course, but it's also what makes it kind of a problematic area to work in and to solve problems within. And so that's what kind of the area I think that people need to understand better, who owns what and how they own it and what's at stake on either side of that line.
Yeah, I agree. And adding to that point, I think the one thing that I have found most interesting throughout my career, and you know, starting out, you're really narrowly focused on the technical aspects of it and pumping out design calculations. But what's been really great as I've evolved through my career and what are, you know, is that really the project, in order to get things done, it's far beyond just the technical aspects, right? It's that coordination with the local governments. When we're looking at, for example, the number of vulnerability assessments and resilience planning projects, working with folks that are, you know, with those local governments in every department, having them all at one table at the front end of the discussion about, well, what are our vulnerabilities? What are our assets? Here's the degree of vulnerability from these different flood scenarios and future considerations. How do, you know, here are some adaptation strategies that we will present, but then that doesn't always fit the confines of their own local policies, right? And so then it's a bigger discussion about, well, what makes good sense in terms of policy changes? And that's something I never really thought on the engineering side I'd find myself spending so much time on, but it's very important, is working with these communities when we talk about raising recommended shoreline elevations, right? In the Tampa Bay, the Regional Planning Council has developed the shoreline model ordinance. Tom was a big key player in developing that model ordinance, which they're, you know, making recommendations for folks to consider going to +5 for bulkheads. And really the language is very comprehensive in the sense that it creates these kind of shoreline districts and talks about based on site considerations and degree of exposure, really emphasizing the need for the nature-based approach instead of coming in with a traditional seawall replacement. And so working with communities and local governments on considering that type of model ordinance language and how to update their specific comprehensive plans, even under the confines of the current SB 250, which we have, which I know is a separate discussion, but working with those floodplain managers and everyone in the room to kind of determine what makes the most sense moving forward, because what's been working for us isn't really working for us. So.
I would agree. Never thought I was going to be working on policy so much. I am a biologist by training, not by any means someone who was trained to work on policy, but you can't do one without the other, really. Piggybacking also off of these, I've touched a little bit on kind of what nonprofits do. I think, like I said, we act kind of as that in between, that bridge between national, federal level work as well as what's happening on the ground. And so I think that makes us a little bit unique. We often have a little bit of a different capacity level than some local groups. But on the flip side, something I specifically have not mentioned that I think, especially towards congressional leaders or local leaders, elected officials, I think there is a common misconception that nonprofits like EDF and other environmental groups tend to only want to push only nature-based solutions. We see that over and over again, that a lot of local leaders think that's all we're pushing for. We are very strategic. As you can see, Conservancy very strategically probably put hybrid solutions in there. We tend to get grouped together thinking that we're just greenwashing. And so, but we're very, very particular in the language that we use in pushing for hybridized green-gray solutions. It's just that we have to advocate a lot more for the consideration of green solutions. So I think that's just a common misconception with a lot of environmental nonprofits, is that we fall into that kind of that Greenpeace category. So.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the tricky part for, any of our nonprofits, especially with that sort of environmental focus, is figuring out how do you, in that sort of responsible, balanced way, try and, balance the needs of protecting nature and allowing it to thrive into the future, but alternately providing solutions for communities. So you're trying to find that pragmatic space, so I can appreciate that. I think just, I'm going to add one more question on my end, and maybe we can answer it just briefly because you already started to dig into it, and then we'll go to our audience, and then we'll kind of wrap up here. My question is, and I already started to hear threads of this, but what partnerships do you think are important for more effective implementation of nature-based and hybrid solutions? And what do those partnerships look like for you in your work?
I guess I can go. I don't know if it's, I'm not going to list like specific groups, but I think when I think of successful partnerships is bringing people to the table that are not typically approached when it comes to implementing nature-based solutions. I can't tell you how many meetings I've been across the state where it's the same 10 people show up, and rightfully so. Those are a lot of the decision makers, right? The water management districts, the chief resilience officers, those folks should certainly be in the room. But I think we are missing a lot of times some of the marginalized communities, those, innovative tech companies, landscape architects. I've been in charrettes and workshops where those folks have been included, and a lot of their ideas have just been so outside of the box that none of us would have ever thought of that, right? We'd go to the typical solutions that we always think of, and it's been really, really valuable because they bring things to the table that those same 10 folks have never considered before. So those have been some of the most successful meetings, and I think you need to bring those civic groups, those neighborhood associations, those certain leaders that just are never part of the conversation to the table. EDF tried to do that this past summer. We, probably a number of you got an email from us over the summer of trying to reach folks, that everything from folks who work at nurseries all the way to the permit folks to contractors, anyone involved in any phase of implementing nature-based solutions we wanted to reach, who just were typically not approached, and asked questions about what are the challenges and barriers to actually implementing these solutions in the state. And so that's what I would suggest. Maybe think a little bit about outside of the box when you start to figure out what type of solutions you want to look for to enhance resiliency in your community is who is not typically at the table.
Yeah, I think one thing just kind of adding to that is we have seen a shift in promoting more emphasis on public engagement and outreach, and in part because many of the grants require that now, which I think was a great thing that came from this funding stream, which we're seeing more funding opportunities now than I've personally ever seen in my career, right? So there's a golden opportunity here to really capitalize on that, and I think that's one way that communities are doing a good job, and we could probably do a lot more, is having, those kind of grassroots, local neighborhood, and pulling the residents into the understanding the greater why we're doing what we're doing, not that, the county or my local government is doing XYZ and shrugging it off because they don't fully understand the full scope of the project. And so I found that anytime we've done public outreach and engagement or workshops where we're engaging and interactive with those folks, it's always been a very good experience and great ideas that have come from it. And those folks really appreciate being in the know and even pulled into the project at the front end. For that one Porto Sueño Park project that I talked about in my slide earlier, we did a pretty big local meeting there where we had 3 or 4 different concepts that we presented to the local residents. Even though it is a county park, they didn't really need to do that, but that's highly used by the folks in that neighborhood there. And we got feedback of all types and try to capture that and help to kind of steer and finalize which option we were going to move forward with, and kind of talk to them about some of these permitting constraints. Why can't we do something a little bit more elaborative? Why can't we put bigger reef balls or extend further into the water or do mangrove platforms? Well, there's, things that I think came from that on both sides that both parties took away from those discussions. And so, that's been very helpful.
And I guess my perspective is going to be a bit different coming from academia, but the partnerships that have been particularly useful for me in my work and for my students in our work has been those partnerships across the campus. The University of Florida is a huge research institution with incredible skill and talent in different fields. We have interdisciplinary centers throughout that I've worked with. The most recent is the Center for Coastal Solutions, which I think Jenna's firm is also a partner with. We have the Florida Institute for Built Environment Resilience out of our planning school, so I have access to planning students and their faculty. We have the Center for Wetlands, which works quite a bit on coastal and estuarine processes as well. So those partnerships and using students as the glue for the faculty has been just instrumental for me in being able to access the science and that skill to help with the policy implementation. Then the other side of the partnerships have been with those communities and not-for-profit organizations with whom we have worked over time. And the difference in a law clinic model from a traditional academic semester model is the semester doesn't end. You have clients. Your clients could be the city of Cedar Key or the city of Sanibel, or it could be the Florida Springs Institute. And you continue with those clients, and you've made your obligations to them, which extend beyond the academic year. So it follows you in that sense as well.
So thanks again to our panelists for sharing. What we're going to do right now is we're just going to take the last few minutes and open the floor up, I think, to see if there's questions for any of the panelists, but I also want to invite just a little potential opportunity to share some ideas as well. Just given that we have probably a variety of folks in the room and a variety of virtual participants, that have varying amounts of familiarity and potential experience with some of these options. Do you have questions or thoughts on other pieces that support moving these solutions forward? So do you have some thoughts on what is really needed to move these options forward? Or I want to open up if you just have questions for the panelists to kind of plumb a little bit deeper into some of what they were talking about. So Bridget, I'm going to hand you this microphone. I have Share that one across.
I'll just while we're doing that, just one other partnership I'd like to mention. It's also in the academic sphere, but it may be of value here as well. The University of Florida is an extension college that is an agricultural extension, but it has coastal extension and so forth. The extension agents are really good and really useful people to work with. They have sort of a neutral understanding, capacity to manage things in terms of community outreach and so forth. They also have access to the university as it up in Gainesville and all the universities in the state. And in the coastal sphere, it's Florida Sea Grant. There are Florida Sea Grant agents in the counties here, and I think it would be very useful for folks to know that their Sea Grant agents can provide at least access to resources to work on these projects as well. Sorry.
And I'll just mention that we have a Sea Grant agent, for instance, talking about some of the work in Cedar Key a little bit later. And the Sea Grant agent for Collier County is Michael Sifos. So there are ways to get a little bit more connected to that resource in our local community. Nicole, is there anything that's come in online so far?
There is one online question. It's from someone who is a Lee County volunteer master gardener, and of course, they're focused on Florida-friendly landscaping. And they say that their group teaches classes and does landscape consultations for interested homeowners and HOAs who have completed the 9 principles of Florida-friendly landscaping classes. They emphasize using native plants, water conservation, healthy ecosystems, and those sorts of things. And they're wondering how groups like theirs can work with all of you in your capacities.
It's pretty easy. I mean, I always tell folks, I mean, you just Google nonprofits in the state of Florida. You're, depending on where you are, you're probably either going to get a mixture of national nonprofits like myself or folks like the Conservancy. You know, we work with the Conservancy pretty regularly. And so oftentimes they will pull folks like EDF in if they feel like there's a certain topic that we can provide additional expertise on. So that's one way to get connected to at least EDF is reaching out. Usually your local nonprofits are going to know a number of other nonprofits and have an extensive network with some national groups as well. So.
Yeah, I would say also if your local community has like an environmental, advocacy board or, planning boards, different local boards that are affiliated with the city, but they're, consist of citizen volunteers. I participate, for example, on the Sarasota County's Coastal Advisory Committee. I find that there's a lot of great discussions that are had in those forums where it pulls folks from in the profession, but also folks that do, not necessarily doing exactly our line of work, but adjacent to. And I find sometimes that those are great venues for having those types of conversations.
Well, we heard 2 talks earlier with the guy with the same hat on from the botanical gardens and, talking about landscaping and so forth. And I think, interacting and seeing if there's any opportunities with your local botanical gardens would be a very good one. There's also something called the Florida Coastal Master Naturalist, which is a program also very similar to Master Gardener, and maybe partnering with that program or even joining that program and then reaching out to community groups to work right along the shoreline, particularly with private property owners, would be a really good thing to do.
Sorry, I just thought of something that might be of interest to this person and anyone else in this room. Tagging a little on to what Tom has mentioned with UF and the extension agents. There is UF actually has with their extension office, Natural Resources Leadership Institute. It's called NERLI. I actually was a graduate last year. It's an 8-month program that the Sea Grant and extension agents actually lead, where you tour the state, learning about different natural resource issues, everything from dairy to sugar to nature-based solutions. We did vegetation and smart land development up in Orlando. So that is also open to just anyone from the public that's interested. There are scholarship opportunities that the public could apply to if they can't fund their way through it. So that's a great way. I highly also encourage like politicians to go through that and actually learn about both sides of an issue and different issues in the natural resource realm going on all across the state.
Okay, we have like 1 minute left, so I'm gonna, I think we have one question in the audience that I see. Did you have a question? Yes, so we'll take your question and then again, I apologize that we can't get to everybody's questions for every session, but again, we'll have our speakers here available for folks in the room to talk to. So we're gonna take this last question and then I will give you your announcement for lunch.
Great. So you all mentioned regulation and policy as part of your scope of what you follow. And so as people who follow it closely, what changes are you anticipating in the next year or so with Trump in the White House and Republican control of the House and Senate? Sorry, it's probably not a 1 minute question.
No, that's a great question. And I'm sure we're all grappling with that at each of our groups. I think what's the advantage of being in Florida is a lot doesn't change for us. We have a we've got a governor who's been pretty supportive of resilience from day one. Even if that's, simply just pumping money into the situation, that's a great situation to be in. So I love to tell folks, I don't anticipate a lot changing for us. We're very lucky that we've been working in a similar climate that I think the rest of America is going to experience. It's a bipartisan issue. Whether or not how you do it, everybody wants to protect coastal communities and our watersheds. And so, we've seen already that there's been legislation been proposed for this upcoming session here in Florida that is specifically centered around looking at mangroves and nature-based solutions for a number of reasons, whether it be insurance, reducing insurance costs, or flood risk reduction. And so I really don't see the landscape changing here in Florida just because of different administrations. We're lucky, I think, in that sense that we've been pretty successful under it already, a conservative group.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I agree with that. The only one thing I guess I would say, depending on, there are some projects that are funded through federal dollars. And so I think that might be the only thing that's really comes to top of mind, outside the state.
Well, again, when we talk about nature-based solutions having to go through the same regulatory framework as development projects and so forth, then I think we can assume that will become easier. At least that's the talk of deregulation. So that's one aspect of it. In terms of funding, I suspect there will be less of it, but the point is well taken that resiliency is something that can bridge the divide, if you will. And I think the funding will still come in, probably a lot less of it, though. I think the Infrastructure Reduction Act funding is going to flow for a while, though. I don't think that tap can be turned off very quickly.
Yeah, so I was just going to weigh in briefly is we're kind of keeping an eye on how some of that funding will play out and trying to understand sort of what's been committed and what hasn't. I think the interesting thing about nature-based solutions, while it certainly won't get us there entirely, there's certainly concerns on the mitigation side, right? It's sort of the tamping down what we have to deal with in the future to adapt to. But I do appreciate that on the nature-based solution side, you are talking about something that at least contributes to, the carbon mitigation while also being an adaptation solution. So I think that's another sort of checkbox that those options definitely have going for them. So I'm going to release us to lunch. So, it's some really great discussion. We know that there's obviously some challenges in implementing, but it's just really exciting to know that there are people really working on these issues. But so we're going to go to break for lunch for everybody. So that's for the online audience as well, because we know everybody's going to need that time to unwind, get some lunch. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back at right at 1 p.m. Okay, so be ready to join me. We're going to do an audience survey, get a little bit more interactive. And just reminding people here and at home that we've got some really engaging content after lunch. For those that are in the room, our volunteers are going to help direct you when you go out into the breezeway there to go towards the right in order to get lunch. But we will help you with that. And I will give some in-room announcements for when we're getting closer to starting up again. So thanks, everybody. Sit tight, go get your lunch, relax a little.